How's everybody doing? We are so thrilled to see so many of you here for this special event, this special occasion. I'm Dwight Andrews, and I'm the pastor of First Congregational Church, and we are in the First Church Commons. This is our gathering space. This is where we do community forums, we do concerts, we do all kinds of things here, and this is the place where we like to think that the people of God gather. So we're delighted to see all of you here tonight. Tonight is a special night, and we've been talking about doing something like this for a long time, and I'm really happy to have some cohorts who have helped to create this evening. And so I want to introduce to you, first of all, the sponsors of this event. First of all, Leslie Gordon and from the Bremen Museum, and Joe Alterman from the Atlanta Jewish Music Festival. Yeah, welcome them because they put it together. Come on. We're going to hear a few words from them, and then I'm going to do some housekeeping, and then we're going to get on with the evening. So delighted to see you all. Here we are.
So I'm Leslie Gordon. I'm the executive director of the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum. Yes, we have a Jewish museum in Atlanta, and it's on 18th Street near Puppetry Arts. I am so thrilled that this evening has happened. It's something that we've been talking about, Joe, Dwight, and I, for quite a long time. And having it come to fruition is a big deal. For us at the Bremen, this is our first foray into something we're calling Bremen on the Road, getting us out of our building. And what better place to start it than at First Church Commons? So I'm really happy about that. Little commercial for that survey that you're probably sitting on. You know, everybody's like, surveys are such a pain, and why do I have to do them? And the reason is that this data is really important, and they're confidential, and you don't have to put your name on for the email list, only if you want to. But this is what grantors ask us for. And tonight's event was paid for by Atlanta Jewish Music Festival, Bremen Museum, First Church, and Emory University. We want the continuation of these conversations, these really important talks, to be funded by a funder. So we're going to apply for grants, and we'll use this data to say, look how many people were there, where they came from, where they live, et cetera. So any information, there's pencils rolling around. We would love to hear from you. Don't have to know who you are. It's totally confidential, and it's aggregated by somebody who has no idea who any of us are. And you can just leave them on the table on the way out. So I want to say something about my dear longtime friend, Reverend Dr. Dwight Andrews. Most of you know what an amazing person he is, but for those of you who he's new to, he is a professor of music theory and African American music at Emory. He is an amazing musician and a composer, and was the music director for all of August Wilson's Broadway plays. So an extraordinary person, a wonderful public scholar, and a dear, dear friend. So I'm so excited that he's agreed to jump into this with us tonight. And here is my other partner in crime, Joe Alterman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm Joe Alterman, the executive director of the Atlanta Jewish Music Festival. And if I've talked to any of y'all about the music festival since I started last July, y'all know that this event is a dream come true. For me, you know, as a musician, I'm so proud to be running this festival, but in the back of my mind, I was always thinking, you know, this is a Jewish festival, but music's for everyone, and how can we reflect that? We're definitely doing that tonight, so it's a real treat to be here and to be with Dwight and Leslie and Ben, and just thank y'all so much for coming. And, you know, anyone else, if I've talked to you about that, and I've talked about the music festival, you know that the burning question in my mind forever will be, what is Jewish music? And no one has helped me think that out more than Ben Sidran, who has just done so much in music. He's a producer, a musician, a writer, a radio broadcast. I mean, he's done everything. So it's really just a treat to not only have him here, but to spend some time with him. He's become a good friend and a mentor of sorts, and I'm just so glad to know you, and so glad you're here. So thank you. And I think that just about does it. So let's bring on Ben Sidran and Reverend Dwight. Yes. Is that good?
Perfect. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. All right. And this wire is just for you can either hold it or you can put it in the stand if you want.
Okay.
So we're just going to check our levels. Can you hear me? Okay, good, good.
And me? Yeah.
All right.
Good.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a wonderful experiment because we are going to be asking some important questions, and this is to be a bit of a dialogue, but I hope that it will be a group conversation about some of these important issues about music and culture and value. I want to introduce the evening to you by saying that in some ways, Ben and I think were kind of brothers from another mother. We were separated at birth because we found ourselves having so many similar points of contact. And in some ways, Ben's book called Black Talk, I don't know if any of you have ever read his book, Black Talk. Raise your hand. None of you are old enough to have read that book but me? Okay. When did you write that book, Ben?
1970.
So he wrote it in 1970, and I began my teaching career in 1974. And after Blues People by Leroy Jones, Black Talk was the next book that I read that really helped to shape my thinking about black culture and black music. And that was due to Ben Sidran, who I never met until 40, 50 years later. We just met this past year. But it's interesting, he and I were thinking about the same kinds of things 50 years ago. And to my great surprise, he got his doctorate in England, but he wrote a dissertation on black music from over there. I wrote my dissertation on Igor Stravinsky, and I wrote it in New Haven, Connecticut. So,
There it is.
a lot of crossing of paths. We have many musicians and people in common, but I think it's our interest in asking big questions, not just about how the music sounds, but where does the music come from? What stories does it tell us? How does it help us to understand who we are and what's important in our lives? And how does music and culture reflect where we are? Baraka once said that the music and the people is the same. And so that if you listen to black people in any generation, you'll get some sense of the times by the very music that they're singing and playing and making. So whether it's the spirituals in the 18th and 19th century, or whether it's the blues in the late 19th century, or whether it's early jazz, you get a chance to see a mirror of the people, what's going on in their lives, what's important. You can literally hear the text of the people by looking at the music. And I think in some ways this very important book that Ben Sidran has written, There Was a Fire, really just amplifies some things that I've been thinking about for a long time, but he put it in print in a way that I think we should really share with one another. So the idea tonight is just to get a chance to talk about some of the important things that we've been thinking about and talking about and playing and writing. And I especially want you to hear from Ben Sidran around some of these issues about Jewish music and identity, American popular music, which in some ways we enjoy the music so much, we stop asking the questions of where it all comes from, and the complicated ways in which American popular music is also a mirror, I think, of who we are. So I wanted to ask Ben to get us started by telling us about the title of this book, There Was a Fire. Where does that title come from?
There Was a Fire is not an expression. It's a saying that comes from a story, clearly an apocryphal story, about the great Jewish rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, hundreds of years ago, was the lead rabbi in the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement was this area in Eastern Europe that was set up essentially as a reservation for Jews. The Jews were all put there. The Russians didn't want the Jews. The Germans, nobody wanted the Jews. And they were not allowed in the major cities. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed citizenship. And so in the Pale of Settlement, millions of Jews lived. Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, whatever they are today. And so they lived in little towns. They called them shtetls. They were not farm towns as such, but they were very poor towns. The Jews weren't allowed to have businesses. They weren't allowed to vote. But they were very engaged in the Jewish activities of learning and of getting on with the business of being a Jew, because this was not new to them. They had been on this path for thousands of years. And they became mystics. Many of them became mystics. And in any case, so there was this famous rabbi called the Baal Shem Tov. And the story goes, at one point, the community where he was a rabbi was in trouble. There was a problem. And he went into the forest to a very special place. He built a special fire, and he said a special prayer, and lo and behold, the community was saved. The next generation, the Baal Shem Tov had passed, also had a problem, of course. That rabbi went into the forest. He no longer knew the special place, but he knew how to build the special fire and say the special prayer, and he felt, well, perhaps it's sufficient, and it was, and the community was saved. Another generation, another rabbi, the community is in trouble again. Of course, the community is always in trouble. This rabbi goes into the forest. He no longer knows the special place, nor does he know how to build the special fire, but he remembers the special prayer, which he says, and lo and behold, the community is saved. Well, you know where this is going. The next generation, the fourth generation, they're in trouble. The rabbi goes into the forest. He no longer knows the special place. He no longer knows how to build the special fire, and the special prayer is forgotten. And he says, maybe just the memory that there was a fire will be sufficient. And it was, and the community is saved. So the book is called There Was a Fire, because essentially it's about memory, and it's about the Jews and memory, and how popular music plays into this.
It's fascinating because in some ways the whole idea of memory, as you present it, if you juxtapose that within the African American experience, so much of the experience of African Americans in this country was designed to destroy memory, to destroy any sense of identity, to destroy any sense of community. And because slavery, and one of its impacts was to dehumanize the very value of each slave, so that they only knew their reality as a slave, which is in some ways very different from the way in which the Hebrew community dealt with this idea of memory, because African Americans have long suffered under the oppression of trying to have every aspect of their humanity destroyed. That's why they couldn't practice African religions. That's why they couldn't practice African language. That's why they couldn't make musical instruments, because all of the things that knit the community together, the slave masters saw as a danger to their role as slaves. And so it's fascinating to see how memory could be a part of the fabric that holds a community together. Or perhaps the way in which the spirituals and the blues have evolved is an attempt to recapture or to create a sense of memory, and maybe that's enough.
And maybe that's sufficient. Well, the fact is that the memory survived because of the music,
Yes.
through the music.
Yes.
The music
Yes.
was, in fact, not just a reflection of the culture, but a way for the culture to go forward. And this has been the case for the hundreds of years that the African American community has existed. The African American community is one of the first American communities. They were here first. People tend to think, oh, that was later after America. No, the African Americans are among the first Americans. And even though the memory was the memory of the languages, the memory of the music specifically was erased, the fact that there was the fact that there was a way to let me see how I can phrase this. The music came out of the memory of the speech, the memory of their idea of time and the passing of events. For example, because there was no written culture, and because they banned, the slave owners banned every instrument, including drums. And the reason they banned the drums is because Africa has a tradition of talking drums. And they were very concerned. They thought, the white population thought, that the drums were beating out like a primitive Morse code, and that messages to escape would be sent, and so they banned the drums. Well, in New Orleans, in a place called Congo Square, they were allowed to play the drums. And in fact, the drums were communicating, but not through Morse code. The drums were beating out a phonetic version of the language itself. So like, for example, today in Ghana, for example, the history of the people exists in the drums. The drummers learn, it takes years and years, the story of the people by playing the drums. So right away, this is a different approach. This is a different orientation toward communication, toward memory. It's a dramatic alternative to what European culture was all about. And so when the African population was brought to the United States, yes, so much was erased. And I think one of the reasons there is a bond is because of the commonality of slavery and the commonality of being outsiders. But the Jews had the written history, and the Africans did not have a written history. So their experience is a profound wellspring of information and identity for Americans throughout the American experience and to this day.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly true that perhaps one of the things that has bound the two groups together is this idea of being outsiders, but then in a certain way kind of insiders. So I found in your book that that was an interesting way to describe the ways in which Jews have always, in a sense, been seen or perceived as outsiders, but then by being on the outside, you kind of flip it and make that the inside. And I certainly think that that's true for African American culture as it responds to its experience, in the sense that we wouldn't have the music as we understand it were it not for the peculiar ways in which African Americans were allowed to participate and not participate at the very same time. And so I always teach my students that when you look at black speech and when you look at language, the ways in which we kind of subvert meanings and turn meanings on their head is really a part of the way in which African Americans very early on discovered a way to kind of create a group by understanding the signs, the signifying, the meanings. And so even when we take something as simple as, you know, he was really cool, and we're not talking about a body temperature here, but when we say he's really cool, what we really mean is what? He's really hot. I mean, he's really playing. He's burning.
He's
right?
burning.
Right.
Well, and also the blues lyric, it hurts so nice.
Yeah.
It hurts so nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a parallel in Yiddish, in the Yiddish culture, where if your mother says your hands are clean, what she means is your hands are filthy, right? In Yiddish, there's this whole saying one thing meaning another. That's one of the many touchstones of the two cultures.
So if you understand the signs and the symbols, then that ties you deeper into the culture, because you understand what's being said and what's not being said. And most importantly, as you talk about what's being meant. And so is that why African Americans and Jews have had this rather special connection? Is it because of this outsider versus insider of the American experience, or is there something else, or is there something deeper? I mean, I think we can long acknowledge that the connections between kind of racism and anti-Semitism, are really cousins. So we know how it works and why it works. But is there a special reason why there seems to have been, at least in the 20th century, as the cities evolved, a special relationship between African Americans and Jews?
Well, yes and yes. Yes, there is something special. And yes, it is part of our common experience. For example, the majority of the Jews came to the United States in the 1880s. 2 million Jews came to the United States between 1880 and 1920, more or less. And they, by and large, lived on the Lower East Side of New York. It was the biggest ghetto that ever existed. It was the largest concentration. And you have to remember, number one, the Jews were not considered white. When the Jews came to the United States, they were considered Oriental was an expression they would say, which I never understood. What is Oriental? How does that? But they weren't white. They weren't black, but they weren't white. They were somewhere in between. So they were not allowed, for example, in the universities or in the law firms or any of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant institutions. They were very poor, and they had just on their pulse a memory of what they referred to as pogroms. Pogroms really were the Russian Cossacks coming through the shtetls and just burning the houses down and murdering people. The reason was simple, because when there are economic problems, the government has to blame somebody, and the Jews have been blamed historically for trying to control the economies, you know. I have to say, this is funny. When I was a kid, when I was like 10 years old, my best friend, who was not Jewish, said to me, "Is it true that Jews drink the blood of Christian babies during their holidays?" And to this day, I wish I had said yes. But the fact is, these things have been passed down for so long. When the Jews arrived in the United States, they identified with the African Americans for many reasons. First of all, the Jews referred to the lynchings that were happening here as pogroms. They immediately identified. Second of all, there's this issue of slavery. The Jews' self-identity is bound up with the idea of being slaves in Egypt. And this is interesting, because there's quite possibility it never happened, right? The slavery in Egypt story, it could be apocryphal, but the story makes it real. And this is something that I've said in the book about the whole Jewish situation. The Jewish situation is based on a narrative. It's based on a story. It's based on the one true God. It's based on monotheism at a time when there were multiple gods, and it was a revolution. And in the revolution, this idea of monotheism developed a kind of a social conscience among the Jews. For example, if there's only one God, and I have the same relationship with the God that Dwight has, I mean, we all have the same relationship, then A equals C, B equals C, A equals B. We're all equal. There's a kind of, I know it's not true, but it works. The fact is, the Jewish experience was revolutionary at some point. And the idea of being cast out a couple thousand years ago and wandering is kind of a metaphor for modern man, you know, modern man adrift in the modern world, the individualism, being on the outside, looking in the inside. So when they came to the United States, they saw African Americans as original Americans, and original Americans who could teach them, who were accessible to them. At the time, you know, the general culture of New York, the Irish, were very actively, through minstrelsy and various things, looking down on the black population because they assumed they were competition for jobs or whatever. In some ways, the Jews identified up. They saw these people as being true Americans, and they wanted to identify with true Americans. They wanted to be American. So you have this sense of the Jews coming here, being cast out, being homeless, not having a home, can't go back to Europe. There's no way back. And they come here, and the story of slavery seems familiar to them. This idea of being a stranger in a strange land appeals to them. And so as the experiences of blacks and Jews in America grows, they really do, for certainly the first half of the 20th century, grow together. It's an experience that they both gain currency and strength from each other.
So does the oppression, does the anti-Semitism, does the racism kind of forge a bond between these two groups to your way of thinking? I mean, is that a part of the fabric? That's one question. And then another question, we'll probably have to talk about this over a glass of wine, is, you know, if the exile really didn't happen, I mean,
We don't know.
you know, these are questions that we Christians don't like to, I mean, Easter had to happen, okay?
We don't know. We don't know. And
Okay.
But this
yeah.
is something else. A point I need to make, and this is about the power of a story, because I think that's really at the bottom of what we're talking about here. I like to say, look, if God exists, it's a miracle. If there is an all-knowing being out there who knows everything that's everywhere in the universe and in our heads, that's a miracle. But if God doesn't exist, and the story of God has moved so much history, so many people have died, so many people have been born, so much history has happened because of this idea of God, of a deity, that's a miracle. You don't have to believe in any particular story to believe that our being here is a miracle, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be consistent with a particular catechism. Well, we're all searching for a way in the year 2019 to be in touch with the best of who we are and what makes us human. You know, we talk about the music. Reverend Dwight said, the music reflects the society, and it absolutely does, even down to the tempo of the songs. You can tell something about a culture by the rhythm, the kind of rhythm, even down to whether the rhythm is strict or dotted eighth. I mean, you can extrapolate from that certain things. But you can also look at it and see that the music created the culture. It didn't just reflect it. Certain aspects of music, particularly popular music, music that flies under the radar of intellectual activity, really supports much of who we are. And so I have this thing I like to say about popular music in America, which without African Americans and Jews, there would be no popular music in America. There simply wouldn't. There simply wouldn't. What was here before blacks and Jews was bad versions of European culture. The Americans wanted to be respected by the Europeans, and so they imitated British dance hall music or Viennese waltzes, or they were in love with Gilbert and Sullivan. It was all fine, it was okay. But it wasn't specifically American,
yeah.
right? The American experience was unique in that we're a country of immigrants. The true Americans, as we know, are Native Americans. Everybody else is here on a visa, more or less, right? So we're all on the outside. Like we talk about Jews on the outside, blacks on the outside. We're all on the outside. And the African American experience, the Jewish experience, are prototypical versions of this. This is why the culture that comes out of these experiences resonates, not only with Americans, but around the world. Because as modernism came along, as the 20s and 30s and the modern world happened, people all over started to feel this sense of alienation and dislocation, and who am I? So the heart of any religion, doesn't matter what it is caring, is caring and being part of something larger than yourself. That's it. We are individually like notes, but together we're a symphony, we're music. We, by ourselves, we're a social animal, we're a social species. And here's something that's interesting specifically about black music in America. The blues didn't exist in Africa. If you look at African music, the blues, as we know the blues, doesn't exist. Certain things existed. The melisma what they call the blue notes, the flat at third, the seventh, the fifth, they existed. The pentatonic scale, that certainly existed. But the blues is an American thing. The blues is the African experience brought to Western culture. It's really a kind of a little miracle. But here's something that I find so interesting, and that is 40,000 years ago, in the caves of Lascaux, France, where they found the paintings on the wall, right, from primitive cultures. Primitive, who knows how primitive they were. They also found musical instruments. They found flutes on the floor made out of birds' bones. And you know, to make a flute, you have to drill holes in a particular place, so when you cover them, a certain scale can be played. The scale that was played on the flutes that were found is the pentatonic scale, the blues scale. So what we consider contemporary is really part of a very long experience. What we know of as popular culture and popular music has probably been going on for thousands of years. And everything else, quite frankly, to me, is a distraction. There is so much more that binds us together than that keeps us apart, that this conversation of blacks and Jews in America, to me, is so important because it represents the best of this idea of caring for one another in America.
Yeah. Well, you've raised some wonderful aspects, yeah. Baraka talks about the blues as being the African Americans' response to a world that had no understanding and no place for the African American except as a slave. So in a sense, the blues becomes an expression and an effort to make a space where there was no space. So you create a space in a world that only understood you as a slave. It was, in a sense, a self-empowering statement, and I think you're absolutely right. The blues only exists here. I mean, that's where it comes from. Jazz only exists here because, in some ways, the peculiar gumbo, to quote Winton, is it's only in America that, you know, all of the different elements come together in a particular way. That's why we don't have jazz evolving in South America. We have certainly African musics.
Absolutely.
But jazz and blues really comes out of the unique kind of cultural history experience, the inside-outside relationships of all of the ingredients. And I like the metaphor of the gumbo for American music because, you know, if you've ever had good gumbo, you don't know what's in it, you know. It's like there's so many things in it, you know, and you just stir it up and it tastes real good. And so you don't try to ask all of the parts. You just want to taste and enjoy the flavor. And I think in some ways that's what our American popular musical heritage is. It's really a gumbo in which you need to take it as the whole and not the sum of its parts, you know, not where did the pentatonic come from, where did this. It's the sum of it that makes it so interesting.
That's so important because in intellectualizing the stuff we're talking about, we do it a disservice, frankly. I mean, we do it anyway, but we do it as a disservice. And it seems to me it's like wanting to understand how a butterfly flies and pulling off its wings. And maybe we understand eventually how it flies, but it won't fly anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is a difficulty. Max Roach once said that the drum set is the most American musical instrument because you have the snare that comes out of the French culture and you have the tom-toms that come out of Africa or the Native American culture, and you have the cymbals that come out of the Middle East. And that instrument itself is a metaphor for the American experience.
So the drum set is like a part of the gumbo. Yeah.
The drum set is a major flavor in the gumbo.
So, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, so if we were going to try to kind of distill American popular music, I mean, how do you think about it, decade by decade? Do you start in the 1920s and move up through Tin Pan Alley and Gershwin and the rest? I mean, how might a novice try to understand the evolution of American popular music?
Wow. There's a lot of ways to go at that. I think the ground level, American popular music, you can get there by talking about Africanisms and Western culture, and it's pretty simple. You have in the expression of African culture, the vocalized tone, where it's considered more eloquent rather than to hit a note right on it, to come up from under it or come up over it. That's considered the essence of style. Where in Western music, you hit the note precisely. A is 440, and you hit 440, and you're an excellent musician. So the first thing is you have these two approaches to what literally is perception, oral perception. And you know what? Maybe they don't actually hear each other. Maybe what's considered elegant in one culture is considered noise in another culture. That's the first thing. The second thing, you have an Africanism in the approach to rhythm. Because what makes American speech so profound, and we're not even aware of it because it's just in us, we have it. But you go around the world, and the way we talk and the way we carry on is unique. It's unique because of the rhythm of our speech. It's hypnotic in a way. And there's a difference, we talked about this at Emory today, between meter and rhythm. Meter is what happens when a metronome clicks and a clock, when the second hand goes around, it ticks. It's a mechanical subdivision of the passing of events. And it's an invention of Western culture to make business happen, right? We all agree what noon is, and so we can all do business. That's really the essence of the clock. But that's not rhythm. Rhythm is what happens when the tide goes in and out. Rhythm is what happens when crops grow and crops are harvested. Rhythm is what happens when your heart beats. And if you listen to your heartbeat, the heart goes ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. It doesn't go tick, 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 all right? The ba-boom is, in musical terms, called a dotted eighth. And the dotted eighth is what makes music swing. Music that swings, and the idea of what is swing, people say, what is swing? The heart of swing is this idea of long, short, tension, release. It's right in there. It's who we are. So that's, on the one hand, that's the aspects of popular music that were brought from the African culture. What did the Jews bring? Well, quite simply, first of all, the Jews brought an ability to monetize. And I know there's the cliche, we all know the cliche, but the fact is, because the Jews didn't have a homeland for generations, what they did is they set up networks all over the world with Jews among Jews were able to trade things. They financed the governments that wouldn't let them be citizens. So when they came to the United States, here's a story. Stephen Foster, the great composer, who wrote Swanee River and Old Susanna and all these great tunes, died broke. He died with 39 cents in his pocket because the music publishing business, which was created by Jews, hadn't been created yet. The Jews took a penny business and made a business of it. So that's not nothing, that's something. But the other thing the Jews did that created this music is they brought a tremendous interest in Western harmony. If you were raised in a shtetl, in the Pale of Settlement, the only way you would be allowed into Moscow is on a scholarship to a music academy. That's why there's so many Jewish violinists coming out of Europe, because they were allowed into the city. So the parents said to the children, play an instrument because you can get on. So the Jews came here with a great understanding of Western harmony. When you take the Africanisms and you put it together with Western harmony, you come upon the invention by Jerome Kern and George Gershwin and Irving Berlin and Harold Arlen of what's called the 32-bar song form, the Great American Songbook. Popular music in America is built on this template of the yearning, the emotional. I mean, all these guys went up to Harlem. Harold Arlen adored Harlem Stride piano. So did Gershwin. They went to school on Willie the Lion Smith. But at the same time, they had this harmonic sense that they knew from their tradition. And so jazz is, in fact, the coming together of these two things. Without the harmonic structure, there never would have been what we know of as jazz or swing, or what we call popular music today. And without the Africanisms, we'd still be back in England. We'd be in London today. There wouldn't be American music. There'd be fake English music.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. We talked briefly about the Nickelodeon, and that I was fascinated by the story of kind of Nickelodeon and kind of how that all got started, and it really was secondary to kind of the interest in a garment kind of.
Well, yeah, this is, history doesn't happen in a straight line. History goes in all directions at once. It's like you throw a stone in a pond, and history is all those rings.
Ripples, yeah.
So the Jews were not allowed to have a business in Europe, right? So they got in what they called the rag business. They could take old clothes and sew it together. And so when they came to the United States, you see pictures of the Jews on the Lower East Side, and they got a sewing machine under their arm, right? And what they're doing is they're creating a garment business. Well, in the process, the Jews created exact size clothing. Up until then, if you didn't have money, you basically didn't look particularly good because you couldn't afford a tailor. But the Jews invented this idea of exact size clothing. Not arbitrarily, it just came out of the fact that they created retail clothing for the masses. So they went from the rag trade to starting these little retail outlets in New York City. And Thomas Edison invented the film camera, and Nickelodeons were popular. These little, you looked in them, and you put a nickel in there, and you could see a little movie of somebody sneezing, and that was a big hit. That was a hit. Sneezing was a big hit. A horse running was a big hit. These were hits. And so a lot of these Jewish merchants on the Lower East Side put a Nickelodeon or two in their clothing stores. And they did so much business in the Nickelodeons that eventually they got rid of the clothing. And these were the first movie theaters. And eventually, Thomas Edison sued a lot of them because they were making their own movies, and Edison had the patent. So all these Jews moved to Hollywood to get away from Thomas Edison. And at one point in the 20s, the major 5 film studios were run by guys who grew up within an hour of Warsaw, Poland.
Wow.
And that's a fact. But they also, these same guys who did the rag business, did publishing, song publishing. And songs, here's something that's really interesting that I love. What we consider, just as part of the world, it's been there forever, popular music. We have popular, whether you like the Beatles, whether you like Stevie Wonder, whoever you love, that form of popular music is American. It did not exist anywhere else. And it came out of this intersection of blacks and Jews. And I have a little way of looking at it, and it's this. The opposite of love is not hate, right? The opposite of love is indifference. You care or you don't care, right? If you hate, you still care. The opposite of love is indifference. And the Jews have this a saying, it's called tikkun olam, where the highest thing you can do is try to heal the world. And there's this mystical image of the world being like a mirror that was shattered years ago. And our job is to put the mirror together again so we can see ourselves, so we can know ourselves. So what these Jewish American songwriters did in creating these songs with an eye and an ear toward the African American experience, and in many ways in solidarity with "Give us, you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, you're tempest-tossed," that poem on the Statue of Liberty. That's a Jewish poem. It was written by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish girl. In solidarity with this idea of America being a beacon for the underclass, the Jews started writing songs about a boy and a girl. So today we'd say, so what? Of course, a song about a boy and a girl, but consider this, 120 years ago, the songs were not written about a boy and a girl. They were written about kings and queens and people that had nothing to do with their lives. The Jews wrote songs about average, everyday people. And you can see when a boy and a girl hold hands and they fall in love, such as it is, that's a little piece of caring. And caring is the opposite of indifference. And so you can see in this world of popular music an urge towards something greater, toward a more spiritual basis for who we are and what we're doing here. What we're doing here isn't about money. What we're doing here isn't about conquest. What we're doing here is about caring. What we're doing here is about being part of something bigger. And again, I go right back to 40,000 years ago and those flutes on the floor. I don't think it's new. I think we've been doing this, and we are part of a very long revolution. And the revolution has been going on for thousands of years, and it's going to go forward. We're going to survive this, and we're going to go forward.
Well, let's hope so, because I was going to ask you, so what happened? I mean, what happened to the caring? What's the nature of American popular music today? I mean, I don't know that I get the same sense of kind of the humanity in the music business, in the music. What's your sense of how did we get here, and where are we?
Okay, you found me out. You're absolutely right. I despair. I do despair. I don't find caring in the popular music today. And as a matter of fact, they're developing, as we're sitting here, artificial intelligence that's writing popular songs. I despair. I despair because of the lack of care for what's true and what's real. I despair because there's no cultural memory anymore. I mean, look at what's happening in Washington, where you can say something different every hour or two, and everybody forgot what was said an hour ago. There's no memory. There's no sense of ease. There's a sense of anxiety. It does feel like we're all suffering from a kind of PTSD right now. Everybody's kind of on edge. Everybody, you know, like if a glass dropped, we'd jump, man. We're all, we don't have a sense of grounding. And so you're absolutely right. And I worry about that because I personally feel for the first time that technology, which always has its own agenda. Technology, this is so interesting. Technology has its own agenda. It shows up. For example, somebody invented the cymbal. The cymbal in jazz is a wonderful thing. So there's a cymbal, originally at the drum kit, it was hung on a cord, right? And when the drummer hit it, it would make a splashy sound and it would reverb, right? But later, they found a way to anchor the cymbal on a stand with a wing nut.
Yeah.
And then it didn't just ring. And so then, well, and the hi-hat, that's exactly right. They put two of these on a stand. And what that did is it changed the time so you could play 4/4 up here and the music would swing in a different way. And that was because technology has an agenda. Along with technology comes a lot of things that we're not anticipating, unintended consequences. And I mean, if you remember just 10 years ago, the utopian things they were saying about social media, how it's going to bring everybody together. Oh my God, it did just the opposite. You know, technology has unintended consequences, and now technology is breeding on itself faster than people can stay on top of it. So yes, I despair. The music that we hear on the radio today is faceless. It's faceless. It's not about a boy and a girl holding hands anymore. I think about how in the 50s, the music was kind of about romance. It was romantic. And in the 60s, it was about love, you know. And in the 70s, disco was about sex, right? And in the 80s, it became about violence. And in the 90s, the music became violent. You know, it's a continuum that doesn't go in a great direction.
I've been thinking about this a lot as we try to figure out where we are culturally, and one, how we push back against some of the ways in which technology seems to govern much of our experience. I have students who go out on a date and they both have their cell phones and they sit across, and rather than looking at each other's eyes, you know, they're texting each other. And they're right there. I mean, like in the same room, at the same table. And there's a way in which we become so screen-driven that I actually think we become more separate. and the whole notion of community, listening to music as a community, as opposed to listening with our headsets, the way in which we privatize the experience of music and sound, I think also goes against this sense of community and of a shared experience. But I also have my own kind of cynical view that all of this serves a kind of a capitalist trajectory, in the sense that once you can commodify everything, once you can commodify violence and say that violence sells, and not only sells, but sells well, and once you can separate that from any kind of cultural memory, so that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, you buy the violence because you have been trained and groomed only to consume. And so it seems to me that all of these things are pointing us away from our own humanity. And I really fear that unless we have conversations like that, and we're in synagogue or in the temple or someplace in the church, in a room where we're breaking bread, I wonder how we counter the ways in which commerce has become the new spirituality, and kids and adults and their grandparents all are consumed by consumption.
Absolutely.
And so that to me is terrifying when we look at the kids that got into the colleges because their parents wrote a big check to USC or Harvard or wherever. I mean, the idea that that could be right ever is astounding to me. And when we look at all of the things around Washington that really are symptomatic of something much greater, that's when I despair. Because, you know, we wouldn't be in the present moment were it not for a lot of people who think that this is okay.
Absolutely. People are making a lot of money today.
And so I think we're trying to find our way back to both to our memory and to our sense of value.
Let me ask you something, because I don't understand it. The trajectory of music in the African American culture has always been so profound and one of the greatest gifts, right? And as it became more sophisticated and it became, I mean, today it's more of a lesson of art music, which is unfortunate, I think, because the power of the music was, hey, it's Tuesday night, let's go to the club and hear the music. And as Art Blakey said, the music is there to wash away the dust of everyday life. That's why we have music. So, but we all see the arc of what happened in black music. And it became all about bling, and it became all about money and getting ours, and it became violent and misogynistic. How is the black community experiencing that in terms of how they arrived through America in the 20th century? How do you look at what's happened with this magnificent tradition?
Well, it's only possible because I don't think that black people as a group are thinking about it in those terms at all. I don't think there's a lot of reflection going on at all. I think we are really the products, I'm talking about not only blacks, but blacks and whites and all of us, but especially I think the black community has been most severely impacted, because when we talk about the great eras of black music, they came out of the black community. The black community determined that it was Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder. They were the portal. The Apollo was the portal, right? So the black community said, yes, Duke is important. This is our guy. What has happened is the power of the cultural control has been wrested from the black community. The black community doesn't control black music. The black community doesn't control hip hop. The guys that control hip hop are the guys that control all of it. And I think we should be very afraid, because we've groomed our young black consumers to think that bling is what's important, right? And so when we look at the kind of the social dysfunction, the suicide rate, the community health rate, the mental health illness in our affluent families, black or white, I think it is really a result of this being completely engulfed in this kind of material folly, if you will. And then people decide, once they have all the bling, why don't I have meaning in my life? And I'm still not feeling satisfied. And I think it's a product of that. I think the myth of black music today is that it's being somehow or other informed by black people. Black people are really at the end of the food chain, not at the beginning of it anymore. And I think that is a problem that black critical thinkers are not addressing, and in fact have commodified why hip hop is hip. You know, and so we have all the theorists and theorizing, which has also become its own commodification. I have dear colleagues who have made a living talking about how important and why it's important, and it really colludes with the commodification of,
Yes.
of the culture.
Yes, because because there's always an impulse to find meaning in what's happening. And we should point out, and there's a truth to the cliche. For many years, the Jews ran the record business and the music business. As soon as the corporations took over, this was no longer the case. And when the corporations took over, the music tanked.
That's
Right?
interesting, yeah.
Because there wasn't a person behind it. There was an algorithm behind it. And the advantage to the corporation of making music that's violent and brutal is, as they say in the newspaper business, if it bleeds, it leads. It's the easiest thing to get somebody's attention. And if you don't have real artists, you don't have the problem of dealing with artists. You just sell the music. So it is commodification, and it's commodification without people behind it. You know, if you go into record companies today, well, for example, Capitol Records, one of the great record companies, it's the building in Los Angeles that looks like a stack of records, a famous place. Capitol Records is empty. There's nobody in the building anymore. They're going to convert it to condominiums and apartments. There's nobody there, right? What's going on today is happening right in front of us. But the infrastructure that our culture has relied on up until the 21st century is gone. It's gone. And it is being driven by algorithms that generate profits. Wow. That's what's happening. But so here we are. I mean, are we living in the cave? Is this 40,000 years later and we're in the cave and you know, we're talking about on the outside of the cave are the beasts? Yeah. What do we have?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the question of the age. I mean, I think that is the question. But I think what I'm encouraged by is moments like this, where sometimes we raise a question that goes out into the atmosphere, and we try to find a better answer than we presently have. But I think that we do have to act. We have to continue to create. And I think my biggest sadness in the present moment is it's not just the quality of the music. In so many of our communities, young people don't get a chance to make a sound. You know, they don't blow a trumpet or bow a string. And if you've never created a sound, if you've never sung, you don't have to be a great singer. You just need to make a note. But if you've never had that experience, in some ways your power has been taken away from you, and you only think that you can buy it or, you know, get it in SoundCloud or something else. And so you were talking earlier about the way in which the music industry had changed, because even the idea of a CD or a DVD, all of that's going away. And so now where is the music to be monetized?
How are we going to support the musicians?
Yeah.
How are we going to support our professional musicians? And this is a wide open question right now. We are literally on the cusp of something in terms of popular culture right now. In that, you know, there used to be cylinders, and then there were 78s, and then there were LPs, and then there were CDs, and each step along the way, this was an artifact that you would take home, and it was mediated by the packaging. You'd look at the package, you'd see the picture, you'd read the notes, you'd become involved, you'd hold it, you'd have this thing, you would exchange money for it, and the money would go to the people who made it, more or less, hopefully. I mean, you never knew. But this was a way that people supported themselves by supporting each other. And now we're on the cusp of a world where that will not exist anymore. The latest iteration was CDs, and next year they will no longer make CDs. Only people of a certain age have CD players anymore. They don't put them in cars anymore, and everything is streamed from various services. And without getting into the mechanics of how that money is distributed, you can be sure it's not distributed to songwriters who aren't connected to big money somewhere. So we don't know what will support the culture, the popular culture. But one thing is for sure, and that is, it's just what you say. You have to get out of your house and come into a room with one another. This, as simple as it looks, and as simple as it seems, is revolutionary. There are two things that I think that are revolutionary actions today. One is to find a way to be happy, because the way we're controlled is by being scared. And if you can find a way, Johnny Griffin, the great jazz saxophone player, once said, jazz is music that's made by and for people who have chosen to feel good in spite of conditions.
Amen.
And it's revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because if you can find a way to feel good, you will not be led by the nose down the path.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the first thing. But the second thing, and it's so important because, as you say, you have a boy and a girl sitting across the table and they're texting each other. It's so important to come out and be in a room and see that you're not alone and see that you're part of something greater and that your problems are shared all around. That's revolutionary. Yeah. And, you know, there's a thing in the Jewish tradition of a minyan. You need 10. Used to be men. Now you can have women there. It took only 3,000 years to recognize 50% of the world. Yeah. But they have to be in the room together. Yeah. You can't tweet a minyan. You gotta be there, and there's something about being there, and that's the other thing we can do. Yeah. And the more we do something like this, come together, have a drink, you know, enjoy. I say when I perform in clubs, enjoy yourself, man. You're already at the top of your class. You came. You could have done any number of things tonight, but you came here. You're already way ahead of the curve. You know, be proud of that you came out tonight. That is something. It's not nothing, and I think that's the hope.
Well, you put it right in the right place, because we want to open this up to a conversation. I want to hear from some of you, only because we could talk about this for about 40 days and 40 nights.
Absolutely.
Not to be biblical, but we could be here a long time. But I want to open it up because I'm certain that people are going to have a couple of thoughts or comments or questions. And so what I'd like to do is to see if we could turn on the house lights to wake everyone up, and we're going to ask Ben, or I'm happy to kind of respond to a few minutes of questions. But first of all, let's give Ben Sidran.
Thank you, Ben.
So if we have a question, just stand up and bark it out, and let's see if we can. We're going to play some music, but we want to make sure that anyone that's pent up with a question or a comment, we want to make sure that we make this a conversation. Yes, Dana?
Well, you know, the question is, how do you change this situation? It seems like we're going in a direction where we don't need people anymore. People are going to become irrelevant. It's just going to be money generating money and artificial intelligence generating artificial intelligence. I don't believe that. I really do feel that this experience that we have, being together, talking, communicating, this is the essence, really, of who we are. And, you know, food that's made in a Petri dish doesn't really taste good. And, you know, the movies that are being made don't give us anything. And the popular culture, the way it's being presented, is not fulfilling, it's not nourishing, and gradually the humanity that we have, that we've spent thousands of years developing, who we are. Music is, in many ways, the best of who we are. It's what we did. It's what made us human. Animals don't play the blues. And I mean, there's something else that I like to point out, and that is, there's something called collective entrainment that animals do. Like when you see birds flying in the sky and they do this together, or fish swimming and they do this together. It's a quality that animals have, but only humans can be collectively entrained by rhythm and music. It's a human element. So food, music, culture, family, friendship, these really are who we are. And yeah, we're going to lose a lot of people along the way. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think a lot of people will be seduced by the shadows on the wall. But that's not humanity. That's not humanity. And it's up to each one of us to maintain our humanity. I mean, we really have to look after our own bodies and try to help protect the souls.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, that's our job. So in the end, I think humanity is going to survive. Let me put it this way. In the long run, it looks good. In the short run, not so much.
Good, Rabbi. Okay, we have a, yes, sir, go ahead.
Well, I want to follow up on your comments.
Stand up and then speak up if you could. We should have brought a mic.
Following up on your comments about the state of popular music today, or maybe it was the state of black-originated popular music today, talking about violence and misogyny. I'm not connected with popular music today at all. I stopped at Motown, and I'm perfectly happy.
Yeah, yeah.
But are you sure that's, is that as universal as you're describing it? Aren't there black artists and popular artists, musicians
Absolutely.
that are singing about all kinds of things?
Absolutely.
And so I just want to make that sure that that's
Absolutely. Of course there are. Of course. The question is, aren't...
is it 1/10 or is it 90% of it is the way you're describing it? I mean,
You know, this is a very long conversation because it goes into how music is manufactured and marketed and how music gets to the public and who determines what music survives and what music doesn't and how is that orchestrated by the economy. Well, almost nothing is on the radio. And the reason is because all the radio stations in the United States are owned by one company now.
Yes. So,
And-
yeah, no, go ahead.
And so it's not programmed. Your radio in Atlanta isn't programmed out of Atlanta. So you might get local weather, but the music you're getting are the same songs they're getting everywhere else, and that's bought and paid for. I mean, it's all, everything that is in music today is bought and paid for. That doesn't mean there aren't wonderful musicians out there, fabulous musicians of every stripe, color, sex, everything. They're out there, they really are. And when you get to know the young people, you do become optimistic because it's wonderful. It's what they're up against. It's what we're all up against at this point. Because in the name of efficiency, we've lost the ability to communicate with one another. And so, yes, boy, you know, you stumble across something great and your heart just melts because it's been so long since you've come across something that moves you. It's out there. It's just harder and harder to find.
And the racial aspect of it is simply this. There certainly are black artists that are creating beautiful love songs and other kinds of popular expressions. The issue is the trope of what's being presented as black music. And most people would think that black music, black popular music, is hip-hop, period. And so it becomes kind of the main narrative of what it means to be black and urban and whatever you want to call it. And the problem with that is, of course, is that it represents all of the most negative tropes about African Americans that have ever been created. It's a recollection of the worst stereotypes of minstrelsy. You have oversexed men, you have women who are loose and immoral, and that is what our kids see and know all of the lyrics. And so it's not that there isn't variety, but to Ben's point, the way in which the industry no longer is local in any sense of the word. Radio and the various outlets for the media have now kind of homogenized, and they, in a sense, are the vehicles for the most negative aspects of the stereotypes that are being continued and have been continued for a century. That's the danger, that there isn't, and this is the irony of the digital age, that there isn't the variety that we all anticipated once we got the internet and when we got all of these new means of streaming music. The main narrative of who black people are, it puts forth a very, very thin slice of the African American experience. And that, I think, does a great detriment to all of us as Americans. Yes, ma'am.
Would love to hear your comments about two things that I think are related. Number one, talk about the indie artists that are out there that aren't going through record
So the question is, comment on indie artists and the whole indie movement, house concerts, and also the resurgence of vinyl and what that tells us. Well, this year, for the first year, vinyl outsold CDs for the first year in a long time. However, the overall numbers are very small, right? So vinyl is fashionable. It's kind of part of the hipster experience. The indie life is vibrant. House concerts are vibrant. It's in many ways too little too late, if you ask me, because the only way an indie artist can be discovered is through massive social media. And every now and then, indie artists get lucky. You know, people get lucky. They've always been lucky. Like if you found, like Bob Dylan, he got lucky. You know, how many Bob Dylans didn't get lucky? We don't know. The same thing with indie artists today that have 400 million hits on a particular Facebook thing or whatever. That's somebody who got lucky. For every one person out there like that, there are thousands and thousands of people striving to do it. The real problem is the infrastructure of the musical life is gone. The infrastructure is gone. You cannot really go from one town to another with a band and make enough money to not only pay the transportation and the food and the hotels, but pay the musicians. The infrastructure's not there. Likewise, all the music now is being streamed, and the model of streaming, I'll just describe it to you briefly. Record companies used to be interested in hits. You make a hit, you sell the artifact, you make money, the person who wrote the artifact gets paid, hopefully, and whatever, right? Now, nobody cares about hits. What they care about is market share. And the way that works is with these streaming services like Spotify or whatever, they generate hundreds of millions of dollars in ad revenue and signing up fees. How does that money get divided? Well, the top five record companies, Universal, Sony, whatever, go to Spotify and say, we have a 40% market share, we want 40% of your revenue. And Spotify says, okay, because they need to play all the music that Universal has or whoever they have. So the little bit that's left at the end has to be divided up among the indie artists. You get a check for 40,000 plays, and the check is for $12. Okay? So the infrastructure isn't there now. That's the problem. Yes, a lot of people are making great music. Yes, with the technology, everybody has access to great recording technology, and you can print it and press it, and you can do all this stuff yourself, and you can even get it out there, and theoretically, your music can be heard around the world. But that doesn't mean you can go and play a gig. Right. It's very strange. Yeah. Well, as I say, we're living at a very interesting time. Nobody has the answers, believe me. It's not like this room is any different than anywhere else.
So we're going to take just a few more questions. Okay, we got y'all. Don't worry, we're going to get to everybody. We'll get this young lady and then the brother right here. And I want you to come back to talk about the 360 deal, the way in which because that's very important for people to understand how the music business works. But first, we'll take your question. Yes, ma'am.
So I guess the question that I have really has to do with your point about children not having access to music, right? Not having an opportunity. And when I think back to our history, there was a time where everyone played music as a form of entertainment and connection with each other, families, whether you sang or whatever. And I'm wondering, what can we do as community members to encourage music education in our schools and our communities? And does it make a difference? And as it does, how can we then take that one step further to kind of create a grassroots backlash to the corporations and the
Right.
monetization of music, like taking it almost to that basic level within our communities?
Right. The question is, how can we address the fact that schools basically have dropped music programs? There are no instruments for kids to play. They don't physically have their hands on it. Quite simply, get instruments into the schools by any means necessary. Because if you're a child and you're given an instrument, right away, what you're doing is you're actively not doing a lot of other stuff you shouldn't be doing, right? You have something. You have something that has a wonderful outcome. Because when you play an instrument, those times when you're sitting there playing that instrument, you're really working on yourself. You know, you're learning to play the instrument. But I like to say, you know, you can spend 20 years blowing through a copper tube. That copper tube is not going to change, but you will be totally transformed. So if you get instruments in the hands of kids, it's a major thing. That you can do that. You can go, you can start a 501c3, a nonprofit. The goal of the nonprofit could be to get instruments in the hands of school children. You can go out and raise funds and buy instruments and do it. That's doable. You can do that.
And the other part of that is, because I have so little faith in public education in the United States, is that we can't wait for the schools to decide that music education is important. The public education system has been dismantled for very, very clear reasons, and it's to create a permanent underclass of people who will never be able to participate. That's why the temples, the churches, your community centers, Big Mama in the neighborhood needs to have people over after school, and you make institutions where kids can get instruments. And we can't wait on public education anymore, because there was a dramatic change in public education after the 1950s. When anybody was educated in the 50s and 60s, everybody had to sing in the band, play in the band, and sing in the choirs. You know, you had to do all of that. That was a part of your preparation as a citizen in an enlightened democracy. The dismantling of public education has one clear intent. It's to dismantle the democracy, right? It's so that you won't have any understanding of your own creative abilities. And so that's why at this little church, we're really intent on creating programs that will allow kids to have some musical encounters. And we won't wait on the schools, because the schools have become so encumbered and they become such political footballs, and they're being run now by people who are themselves miseducated. So they have no sense of value. And so this is our opportunity to really become radical revolutionaries and to do it wherever we can do it. If we do it in the church on Saturday, and then synagogue on Sunday, I mean, y'all can figure it out. But we can get that done, and I don't think it takes a legislative act, because I frankly think that it's going to be a long time before our legislature moves to rebuild the fabric of public education in America.
You know, yes, and yes, you described the situation we're in perfectly. But I just want to say, you know, for years we've found bad guys. I don't think it's bad guys. I think it's capitalism. I think it's the system we're under. You know, I don't think there are guys saying we need to disenfranchise everybody so that we can increase profits. No, they just say we need to increase profits, right? And along the way, these things are collateral. This is the collateral damage.
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
it's important, because if we get distracted into finding enemies everywhere, we're not going to do the work we need to do.
No, you're absolutely right. But I think that is the point, that the system is creating this collateral damage in which we are all kind of lessened by it. Let's hear from this person. Yes, sir.
We are in a revolution
So the gentleman was talking about the positive aspect of people, young people particularly today, who have found new ways with the new technology to bring new music to market, and that we're being over nostalgic about the past because in the past people didn't get paid and the system wasn't equitable, and that's all absolutely true. Reverend Dwight wanted me to talk about the 360 deal, because it's part of the evolution of the recording business. You know, the recording business, it has only been this huge thing for about 50 years. Up until the 50s, more or less, records didn't sell millions of copies. A big selling record might have been 100,000 copies. There wasn't huge dollars in the record business. And in the 30s, during the Depression, when the major companies like RCA ran into financial difficulties, the first thing they did is they offloaded any specialty recording. That meant any ethnic recording, what they called race records at the time, but also any country, whatever. Those records, that business was picked up by small entrepreneurs, most of them Jews, as it happened, because it was a penny's business and nobody wanted to get into it. The Jews, some of them were fans and very enlightened, like the guy who started Blue Note Records and Jerry Wexler, who was at Atlantic Records. These were people, or Milt Gabler. I mean, God bless Milt Gabler, who put out Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit and who recorded Louis Jordan, and amazing stuff. These were visionary guys, but there were also guys who got in the business. There was one guy, Hi Weiss. These guys, you know, some of them were in the injection molding business during World War II, making toilet seats, and they realized they could also make records. I mean, it wasn't about art. And a lot of people did not get paid. And there's a lot of animosity historically about that. Hey, you made all this money and I didn't. But the fact is, that money, by and large, was made after the Rolling Stones discovered Muddy Waters. You know, when Muddy Waters was making records for Chess, it was a penny's business. So yes, there were a lot of abuses, but the business was totally different. What happened in the 60s, really, with the peace and love thing, when the numbers grew up, really what it was about was the teenage culture. When young people got their hands on money and they became an identifiable market, we're going to sell to young people, it exploded. And the record business exploded. And all the old guys from the old days, guys like John Hammond or Goddard Lieberson, who were aesthetes, were replaced by guys who were looking for the edge, looking for the extra dollar. And they didn't know how to get it, so for a while we had wonderful free-form radio that played everything, and we had record companies recording everybody, whatever. You know, statistically, in the record business, even today, but all through the business, only, let's say 5%, but it's probably less, of the releases made money. For about 5% supported the other 95% of what was put out there. And that was an acceptable risk, because when they made money, they made so much money that there was largesse everywhere. Well, eventually, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, one thing led to another, where only bigger sales would do. I mean, I could explain how that happened with the companies expanding and deciding they were going to own their own distribution networks, which increased their overhead, and one thing got into another. But by the 90s, record companies had invented something they called the 360 deal. I'm going to waste so much time here, but it's important. There are two ways you get paid when you make a record. One, the record company is supposed to pay you if they sell it, right? That may or may not happen. The other way is that the song itself, if you write the song, there's a copyright. It's protected by federal law, and that's a separate payment. So when the Beatles wrote I Want to Hold Your Hand, they got paid something for the record, but they also got paid for the song. And the money that comes to the song, for every 10 cents that comes in, 5% goes to the writer and or writers, and 5 cents goes to the publisher. Who is the publisher? The publisher could be a gangster, it doesn't matter. The publisher is somebody maybe who made the deal. who's in the middle of it. And so if you look in the records in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people's names were on records they had nothing to do with. They were DJs, and they would say, well, look, if you play the record, I'll give you a piece of this. So the drilling down into the asset is what the record companies got good at. And by the 90s, when they had done so many stupid things, I mean, really, the whole business that we're in right now, the business model, is because the record companies sued Napster. It seems so simple, but it's the fact. Napster was passing around free music. Well, radios pass around music for free too, but there's a model for monetizing radio play that goes back to the creators. But the record companies were so determined to be in charge and to control everything that they sued Napster. Not only Napster, they sued kids who had downloaded from Napster. Well, the horse was out of the barn. They lost credibility, and subsequently they were scrambling to find a way to make money. And they invented something called the 360 deal, where if they signed you, they got a percentage of your gigs, your live gigs. They got a percentage of your t-shirt sales. They got a percentage, in fact, of all your activities. And I like to say, that includes, theoretically, if you create a cure for cancer, the record label owns a piece of that. That was what happened. Well, eventually, that whole system just toppled. Except today, anybody who's signed by a major label, if they cure cancer, the company's going to own it.
Wow.
That's the truth.
Scary. Okay, last question, because I want to get a chance to hear Ben play something. And so, yes, sir, you get the last word. Uh-huh.
Couple things I want to say. Fix. One of the things that I think is the fix is when Jewish culture married African-American culture in music. African-Americans were great musicians. They were horrible business people. Distribution came from Jews. I was on the music side, and some Jews brought me in and taught me. I was a super, very successful student. And you know the guys that I know. It was a system. We were extremely successful. Now, nowadays, the only way you're going to fix it is back through the same system. I'll give you an example. I left music and went to gospel. Along with Bobby Jones Gospel. You ever heard of it?
Of course.
Okay. That's me. I took the same thing we did with Lionel Richie and the Commodores and did it with music. And with gospel music, I did the same thing. Kirk Franklin. Discovered him. How do I get a hit? Forget the words. Do the beat. If you get the beat, nobody will know the words until it's over. And if they're dancing, they don't care what the words are. So if you notice, we started that with the Lions. Old church people kind of jumped on us. But we kind of tricked them with Kirk Franklin. You understand? And it hit. And brought in a whole new audience. Same thing, like for instance, on the payments. I'm in technology now because I'm deaf music. Now, there's systems called blockchain. You familiar with it? Everybody heard that thing?
He was saying they're talking about blockchain, which is behind Bitcoin.
Right. That's what we do now. Can't do it in the U.S. because it's illegal. But we have a system on blockchain and an app called Sound Dion. If 8 people write a record, we have a thing called a smart contract. And on that contract, it states who gets what. So every time that credit card is swiped, you get your money the same time everybody gets their money.
Well, what you're talking about is the upside of technology. And the technology is not only evil, it's also
Technology is ever evolving.
ever evolving. Well, I hear you. Okay. Technology can't be evil, only people can be evil. Yeah, but the point is correct. The future could very well bring new ways to get paid equitably and quickly. I mean, I, for example, started recording for Capitol Records in 1971. That first record came and went in a heartbeat. Eventually, it got put out on CDs. Again, eventually, it was sampled by some group called Cash Money Click. All this stuff. I never got paid. I never saw a penny from it, from the record. So to that gentleman's point over there, I mean, we didn't get paid. Now, where there's no distribution, all my old records that are getting played on Spotify, I get the check for $12, and it comes regularly, right? So yes, there's that, and I'm one of the lucky ones because I'm grandfathered in. I'm old enough to have made records that showed up on Spotify so I can get my $12. So there is a possibility in something like blockchain, which is a secure way to maintain contractual relationships. They can't be changed. It works. Hey, I've got a song. I've got a song I'd like to do that speaks to what we're talking about.
Okay.
Can I do this?
Yes, please. Ben Sidran.
And by the way, thank you for staying with us. You've been wonderful. You've been with us, and we can feel your presence. So thank you for hanging in. I might be wrong, but it sure seems to me the past ain't what it was, and the future ain't what it used to be. Oh, everywhere I go, I hear people say, man, you should have been here yesterday. You should have been here before the fall. Now it's the price of everything and the value of nothing at all. Oh, I could be wrong, but I think those days are gone. The past ain't what it was, and the future won't be here long. Now we're all just the sons of the Dharma bums, wading in the water of the infinite flow. And every time you take a look, there's another dead guy in your address book. Where have all the good ones gone? Why did they leave us here to carry on? I could be wrong. But everywhere I go, them that knows don't talk, and them that talks don't know. If silence is the answer, what could the question be? I might be wrong, but that's how it seems to me. Now we're all just the sons of the Dharma bums, wading in the water of the infinite flow. And every time you turn a page, another actor leaves the stage. Where have all the good ones gone? Why did they leave us here to carry on? I could be wrong. But everywhere I go, Them that knows don't talk, and them that talks don't know. If silence is the answer, what could the question be? I could be wrong, but that's how it seems to me. We watch as time passes, and then so do we. So do we. So do we.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Sidran, let's hear it for him.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a wonderful evening. We're close to our time, but I want to do one last thing. Joe, I want you to come and give a sharing. I want the two of you guys to close us out because we're almost at time. We'll figure it out. But all of you know Joe Alterman as the head of the Atlanta Jewish Music Festival, but he's a fantastic pianist. And so we want to put these two guys together so that they can close us out because these are two very, very talented cats. Let's hear it from Joe Alterman and Ben Sidran. All right. I feel like I'm a owner of a club. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Alterman on the piano. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Sidran on the piano. Before we go, we want to tell you that Ben has some books on sale, and I assume some other some CDs. We want to thank you for coming because this is important. Doing what we're doing tonight is important. We want you to come back to First Congregational Church on the first Friday of every month. We have First Friday Jazz. And so we want you to come and join us. When you're not in synagogue, you can come to church on Sunday, 11 o'clock. And so we'll see you one place or another, but I want to make sure you get a chance to buy books before we have to close out the care parking lot. So ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Ben Sidran one more time. Thank you, Bremen Museum. Thank you, the Atlanta Jewish Music Festival. Yeah. Amen. Amen. Blessings to you and shalom.